the National Assembly. We look at a question from the IFP's Narend Singh to Deputy President Kgalema Motlanthe. He asked whether the Deputy President's recent visit to Ghana was in pursuit of finding alternative oil resources in view of the United Nations threat to call for a ban of oil imports from Iran. Mr. Singh also wanted to know whether Mr. Motlanthe intended to visit more oil-producing nations in Africa and elsewhere to source alternative sources of crude oil supply. President Motlanthe pointed out that there was no United Nations resolution calling for a ban of oil imports from Iran.
It is in fact the United States of America that is imposing sanctions against foreign banks engaged in transactions with the Central Bank of Iran or United States designated Iranian banks. These sanctions are particularly stringent with regard to petroleum-related banking transactions. Our visit to Ghana focused on energy, which included both oil and gas. We have always and will continue our efforts to diversify our energy supply. In fact, every country in the world whose economy depends on oil will continuously seek to diversify its energy supply with a view to ensuring security of supply in the long run.
In a supplementary question, Mr. Singh said he was indeed referring to threats from the United States and not the United Nations, as it appeared erroneously in the written question. He still wanted to know if government had considered the impact of possible U.S. sanctions against countries who bought oil from Iran, as was reported in certain newspapers.
We've noted in recent times that our oil imports from Iran has reduced drastically, and we welcome these new initiatives to look elsewhere in Africa and other parts of the world for oil supplies. Because if we look at the fluctuation in the price of crude oil, we notice it has been as low as $30 a barrel right up to $145 a barrel, and fuel to the consumer, 3 Rand 50 10 years ago a litre to 12 Rand 20 almost a few weeks ago. But the question, Mr. Deputy President, is, did government, when the U.S. threatened to impose the sanctions on our banks, consider the impact it would have in our relations with the Federal Bank of the United States vis-à-vis our banks here in South Africa?
Yes, indeed, the UN sanctions which target banks do affect us. However, the United States has since extended what they call an exception for 180 days to South Africa. What that means is we have the right to continue sourcing fuel from Iran. However, within that 6 months, we have to keep them posted, and they monitor whether, our quantities are decreasing or not, which means in the next 180 days, when they review that on the basis of the volumes, they may decide that indeed they impose the sanctions against our banks and so on. So that is why we have to ensure that we navigate properly and not expose ourselves here and the South African banks.
There were more follow-up questions. The next question came from COPE's Leonard Ramatakane. He asked if South Africa was looking at oil imports from Angola and also at prospects in South Africa itself.
In terms of our own home-based resources, what is your projection in terms of depletion of the resources, in terms of basically the energy resources, and of course, what is the strategy to explore more in terms of mining basically at home? What is the strategy? Is there planning that is already been put in place around that particular aspect?
We are not only focusing on African sources, we are also looking at countries such as Saudi Arabia, because the refineries in South Africa also determine what type of crude we should source If it is heavy, it wouldn't be cheap to process it here. So we look at all those options. And we are quite confident that we should be able to have security of supply, and we'll continue to diversify. It's an ongoing process because, as you know, you can't rely on one source because the wells may dry up or something else may happen. So it's important to always ensure that we have alternatives, yes.
As you stated, South Africa is one of the few countries that were granted a 6-month grace period in which to secure contracts to substitute for our Iranian crude supply. But given that 30% of our current supply comes from Iran on a term contract, we are under extreme pressure to tie up alternative contracts within the next 4 months if we are to ensure security of supply. Is this work, however, being left solely up to Petro SA, or is the government at the highest level engaging with oil-producing countries to secure future supply? And I ask this because Nigeria recently indicated that it could not secure contracts with Petro SA as it has to be a government-to-government contract. And now Nigeria will be publishing its list of countries that it will be supplying at the end of this week. And can South Africa therefore expect to find itself on this list? If not, will this indicate that South Africa is not taking this issue seriously enough? And what will you do to ensure that we have alternate supplies in place within the next 4 months?
In fact, we do both. We don't rely only on Petro SA or the South African oil companies. We also engage sister governments as government to ensure that the supply can be secured. We engaged the government of Nigeria. As you know, I hosted the Vice President of Nigeria, and in that binational we agreed that South Africa would indeed secure supply from Nigeria as well. But as I indicated earlier on, that we also have to do other things. For instance, to ensure that the refineries are in place to process that kind of crude as well.
Let me also commend the government for defending the interests of the country in the face of increasing importation of petroleum products, as well as the creative way of seeking diversification towards importation of crude oil. Of course, against this unilateral and unwarranted sanctions by U.S. against Iran. Of course, Speaker, such does not provide a comprehensive and lasting solutions to the fundamental challenge of security of supply in South Africa. And now that the government has been to Ghana and other oil-producing countries in pursuit of the diversification of oil trade, the question is, to what extent is the government content with this initiative? And what are the implications of its trade with Iran in particular, as well as our refining capacity as a country?
The current arrangements do take care of our fuel needs. And what we are busy with now is to ensure that we also have contingency measures, because our storages are also there to be filled up. We have good relations and goodwill with many oil-producing countries. And so we can source from almost all of them. The only challenge we have is that the way our refineries are configured, they work better with light oil. That is why countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran are important sources. And as you know, that we only source 29 to 30% of our fuel, of our crude from Iran. And so when we begin to diversify, we will reduce that percentage to acceptable levels, so that we do not remain as vulnerable as the situation would make us to be if we were not taking these precautionary steps.
Tomorrow is Youth Day, and both the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces have debated the challenges facing the youth. After the break, we focus on the debate in the NCOP, where DA leader Helen Zille came under fire from ANC benches. Stay with us.